Bonjour et bienvenue à notre vidéo de français avec Monsieur Robichaud. Hello and welcome to another French help video with Mr. Robichaud. In today's video, we're going to be looking at le passé composé en français, so the past tense in French, and specifically we're going to be looking at verbs that take the auxiliaire avoir. So let's get started with talking about what exactly is le passé composé and when do I use it? Well, le passé composé is a verb tense similar to le présent. It describes actions in the past that have already happened and are completed. So it's important to remember this part. They're already completed. The action is finished. If the action is still ongoing, we have another verb tense called l'imparfait in French that we're going to use to conjugate those verbs. But if the action's already been completed, we're going to use le passé composé. Unlike conjugating in the present tense, where there's only one verb, the passé composé is composed of two verbs, which is why they call it the passé composé. It's composed of two parts. So the first part it's composed of is something we call in French l'auxiliaire. And the second part it's made up of is called le verbe, or le participe passé in this case. For the auxiliaire, we have two choices. We can either use avoir, or we can use être. It's important to remember that we're going to use these verbs in the present tense, au présent. And for the participe passé, like I said, we're going to use the verb. Now, if this looks confusing, don't worry, because this is actually one of the most simple verb tenses to conjugate, and you'll see in just a second. So some of you may be wondering, well, if I can use avoir or être for the auxiliaire, which one do I use? Well, that's a very easy question to answer, and to do that, you're going to have to look at the verb. Now, 99% of all verbs in the passé composé will use avoir, and only verbs belonging to something called Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp will use être as the auxiliaire. So we can develop this rule that most of the time we will use avoir as our auxiliaire. But in case you're wondering, let's take a very quick look at when to use être before we get into avoir. So here's a quick look at Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp. En français, il y a 16 verbes qui utilisent l'auxiliaire être. And these 16 verbs can be remembered using the acronym Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp. So in the next video, when we talk about the passé composé with être, I'll go over this a little bit more, but it's pretty straightforward after you finish watching this video. If the verb is part of Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp, you'll use être instead of avoir as your auxiliaire. Alright, so the first part of this conjugating in passé composé, remember I said you needed to have the auxiliaire avoir or être. So here's a quick review on avoir. You have j'ai, tu as, il a, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils ont, and elles ont. So this is going to be your first part of conjugating the passé composé. And since we already spent a bunch of time reviewing this, and I'm sure you've seen this verb so many times already, this should be a breeze to you. So the first part, you really don't need to do anything except for remember how avoir is conjugated in the present tense. Alright, so part 2 of making the passé composé, we need to get the verb at its participe passé, so the past participle in English. Now, don't worry if you don't know what that means, because I'll show you what it means in French, and it'll be a lot more simple. So, for example, if the verb ends with er, like parler, the er is going to change into an e accent. So you would have parler with an e accent aigu. If the verb is an ir verb of the second group, it's going to change to an I at the end. So, for example, we have finir is going to change to fini. And if the verb is part of the third group, which is the re verbs, the re is going to change to a u. So, for example, we have vendre, and it's going to change to vendu. So, let's add part 1 and part 2 together and make the passé composé. So, remember I said you needed two things. The first thing you needed was l'auxiliaire, and that could be avoir or être. The second thing you needed was the participe passé, which is the verb. So let's take an example of verb, and let's use the one from the last page. Let's use parler, which means to talk. So you're going to use avoir. Like I said, most of the verbs are going to take avoir, and in this video, we're obviously focusing on avoir. So we're going to use avoir. And if you forgot avoir, don't worry. J'ai, tu as, il, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. So that's going to be the first part of the passé composé for you. Now the second part is the verb. So remember, er verbs go to e accent aigu. So, for all of these, even if it's j'ai, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, ils, or elles, does not matter what the pronoun is, the conjugated form of this verb is going to be parler, with an e accent aigu at the end. So, when we put it all together, we have parler, which is to talk. So you have the pronom j'ai apostrophe. The auxiliaire avoir was a, right, from the last one, j'ai. And the participe passé of the verb was parler. So in the passé composé, you would have j'ai parlé, tu as parlé, il, elle a parlé, nous avons parlé, vous avez parlé, or ils, elles ont parlé. So you can see why this is one of my favorite verb tenses. It's actually one of the easiest to do. And I'll show you for the other two groups, the IR and the RE verbs. We'll do an example. And it's just as simple. All right, so let's do a second example now with an IR verb. Let's do. So remember, the first thing we needed was l'auxiliaire, and that could be avoir or être. And the second thing we needed to make the passé composé was the participe passé of the verb. So like I said, let's choose an IR verb. We have finir, which is to finish. And once again, this is going to fall under avoir. So there's our avoir chart. J'ai, tu as, il a, elle a, nous avons, vous avez, ils, elles ont. And remember, IR verbs just go right to an I. So finir would turn into fini. So if we put it all together again, you'll see the same thing. J'ai fini, tu as fini, il, elle a fini, nous avons fini, vous avez fini, ils, elles ont fini. So once again, it's the same thing. Once you conjugate that first verb, it's the same thing all the way down. And as long as you remember avoir and être, this is why I said they're the two most common verbs, you'll be okay. Let's look at the last example. We're going to use an RE verb this time. So remember, we need the auxiliaire, avoir, être, and we're also going to need the participe passé to make the passé composé, which is the verb. So let's take a look at RE verbs this time, and we're going to use vendre, which means to sell. So avoir, once again, there's our avoir chart, and if you remember from our last slide, verbs that end in RE are going to change to U. So we have vendu. And when we put it all together, we have j'ai vendu, tu as vendu, il, elle a vendu, nous avons vendu, vous avez vendu, ils, elles ont vendu. So you can see why, like I said, this is one of my favorite verb tenses. It's actually one of the most simplest verb tenses, in my opinion, to learn. As long as you know avoir and être, and you can remember these three changes that happen. ER goes to E accent aigu, IR goes to I, and RE goes to U. You're all set with this verb tense. So, as always, at the end of my videos, j'aime faire un peu de pratique. I like to do a little bit of practice. So, this one asks you, conjuguer les verbes au passé composé. And on the top right-hand side of the screen, I've also added our little cheat sheet to help us remember. So, the first one we have is chanter, which means to sing. Now, you'll notice it ends with an ER, so we're going to follow our rule, and we're going to change chanter with an ER to an E accent aigu. So we have chanter. Now, like I said, it doesn't matter if it's je, tu, il, elle, nous, vous, ils, or elles. It's all going to be the same conjugated verb. The only thing that's going to change is the beginning. J'ai chanté, tu as chanté, il a chanté, elle a chanté, and so forth and so on. The next one is découvrir. And if you remember, IR verbs get changed to I. So in this case, we would have découvrir. The next one is perdre, to lose something. And you'll notice it's the third group. It has an RE. So we're going to change that RE for a U. And we have perdu. The next one we have is ouvrir. And it's another IR verb. And if you remember, IR goes to I. So we have ouvrir. The next one is danser, to dance. And it's an ER verb. And we're going to change that for E accent aigu. Danser. And then we have acheter, to buy something. Once again, we have another ER verb, so we're going to change that ER for E accent aigu, and we have acheter. And the last one we have is attendre, which means to wait. It is an RE verb, and we are going to change that RE for a U, and we have attendu. So, here's my favorite part. Exceptions. Now ask yourself, would it be French without having exceptions? Probably not. Well, I'm just going to show you a list of some of the exceptions, and to tell you the truth, I wouldn't try and memorize these all in one shot. As you come across these in French, you'll start to memorize them slowly and slowly. If you were to try and apprendre, to learn, all of these verbs in one shot, I think it'd be a little bit difficult. I know my brain doesn't work that way, and I don't think Jackie's brain works that way either. So this is one of those cases where, you know, if you want to take a couple of verbs every so often and try and memorize them, that's great. So let's take, for example, the verb apprendre. Apprendre is an RE verb. It's the third group verb, and we know that RE verbs in Passé Composé change to a U. So it would be apprendu. Now, it doesn't take a French person to know that that really doesn't sound too right. There's something wrong with that, and they'd be correct. It's not apprendu, it would be appris, which just happens to be a lot shorter and sounds a lot nicer than it. So there's no really rule to know when a word is an exception and when a word's not going to be an exception. It's one of those things that you're just going to have to slowly learn as you learn French. And a lot of the time, you know, it's going to be the same exceptions that you always come across. Like avoir is a huge exception all the time in almost every verb tense. Same thing with être. Another very common one is apprendre, dire, écrire, boire, recevoir. Another one is vivre, pleuvoir, devoir, and mettre. I guess most of the ones I chose for this chart are some of the most common ones, but it's just one of those things that you're going to have to just memorize them or learn them one at a time, slowly by slowly. If you Google lists for exceptions in French, you'll be learning verbs forever, so I suggest you just learn them as you go. So that's all for today's video. I hope that conjugating Passé Composé makes a lot more sense now. I know in the beginning it kind of looks a little bit complicated. You're like, what, I gotta use the verb from here and a verb from here and put them together? But it really isn't that hard. It's actually one of the most simplest conjugating tenses you have, and I find it a lot easier to conjugate than it is for the présent. So I hope that you've learned something from this video, and I hope that now you'll be able to conjugate le passé composé without a problem. So that's it for today's video. Au revoir mes amis et à la prochaine.